So yeah, welcome to the Critical Accounting Podcast. I'm here with Hendrik Vollmer, reader in accounting at Warwick Business School. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Hendrik. Thanks for volunteering.
Thanks for coming, James, and inviting me.
No, it's a pleasure. So Hendrik, you've been on the editorial board of Accounting Organisations and Society, a member of CESA, it's a Centre for Social and Environmental Accounting Research. You've had many positions over the years, editor of Zeitschrift for Sociology, a German language journal for sociology, and you are the author of Sociology of Disruption, Disaster and Social Change, and something we'll get onto a little bit today, currently editing a collected volume, the Handbook of Accounting and Society.
That's right.
So thank you, as I say, thank you for volunteering to speak to us and contributing to the podcast. I'll just ask you a little bit about yourself, first of all. Could you tell us a bit more about how you got into critical accounting and how you found your way into the discipline?
Yeah. So I got into it without really knowing much about accounting or what accounting is, because the phrase doesn't really exist like that in German. So I was studying in Edinburgh, 97, 98, and doing modules in the Master of Science and Technology Studies. And one of the teachers was Donald Mackenzie. And as I was coming to the end of my stay there, I thought I'd ask Donald, what he thought the interesting topics were to get into. And he told me accounting would be an interesting topic. And he called it ethno-accounting at the time. Which now sounds a bit strange, but actually Donald at that time was getting into accounting a bit. And that was also the time he got into kind of finance. So it was all part of the same, I think, map for him. But I didn't know what it was. And I went to the library and started copying, as we did at the time, papers from AOS, which I took in my suitcase back to Germany. And I thought, okay, let's give this a go. And I started reading a bit. And from then on, I kind of cultivated a bit of an interest. I got a job with Karin Knorr and Alex Preda at the time, who were also getting into sociology of finance a bit. And I thought, okay, maybe I can be the accounting person in this ensemble. And that's how it all started. So I kind of decided that this should play a role in my PhD. And some of the stuff I did then, I ended up publishing a paper in CPA on that basis. And that was my entrance. Met Keith Robson at an event that we had in Bielefeld in, I think, 2000. I also met Yuval at that event, who came instead of Donald, and he was Donald's PhD student. So kind of Don Mackenzie is kind of a person who pulled many strings there. And since then, I had accounting on the map and was always toying with the topic and getting into it more and more. At the same time, kind of having to justify what I did to my German colleagues who wouldn't know what accounting is.
Well, that's super interesting. I mean, in the 2000s, the social studies of finance really developed and took off, and some of these ideas of the performativity of economics and finance and some of the measures and models, creating the conditions or the outcomes that they sort of sought to describe became a really big theme. And then, so what's the role of accounting in that sort of body of sort of social studies of finance, would you say?
Yeah, it's not really that clearly defined, because many of the people who started with social studies of finance, they were more interested in markets, right, and how markets come to be. And accounting was always part of the story, but it wasn't really central to it. People were, at that time, really interested in understanding markets, I think, and how markets work and how to understand them a bit better as a social phenomenon without, drawn on the usual suspects and without making it kind of an object of economic theory, but kind of also, doing a proper social science of markets, proper sociology of markets. So accounting kind of played a role in the broader kind of orbit of that. And certain people like Keith Robson also got interested in it from early on. Also I think Fabien Muniz had accounting on the map early on. Yeah, it didn't really break into that literature too much, right? Part of that might be because accounting had its own discourse already that was well established and its own community. It was a bit maybe the other way around, that people from social studies of finance entered accounting, and that's Yuval got a job in accounting and started in social studies of finance, and I myself probably also a bit, though I came in more from kind of economic sociology, sociology of organizations. That was more my entry point rather than just sociology of markets. So.
So it opened up this kind of space where people, we already had a critical discipline at that time, and people were looking at the active role that accounting played.
Yeah.
And then this sort of opened up a space where it's like the making of markets, making things valuable, and the kind of operationalization of that through accounting kind of practices and statements. Is that about right?
Yeah, well, there were connections, but they weren't really that well developed. For me, I was really discovering accounting because I didn't know anything, and I was kind of amazed at what existed at the time because sociologists wouldn't know about it. And part of the early stuff I did was kind of I was almost an importer of some of the stuff that existed into sociology, particularly in Germany, where people hadn't noticed it much. I think it got noticed more here in the UK with people like Peter Miller, who were kind of well known, I guess, also in sociology. But in Germany, I could that was news. And I thought, okay, so I can be the one delivering the news. And actually, in a way, I capitalized on research that had been going on for decades at the time, but nobody knew about it in Germany for sure.
Well, that's interesting. I resonate a little bit with that discovery of the critical accounting field. When you sort of first, because I did my qualification in practice, not really knowing anything about social science. I did my undergraduate in maths,
right.
So I was discovering the field for the first time, and reading some of your papers and that stuff through the 2000s was probably my first experience of critical accounting.
Right.
So you develop quite a lot of theoretical ideas. You're developing the work Bruno Latour to some extent, who you've used more recently with the politics of nature. But Donald Mackenzie and Mike Callon, the idea of kind of framing and overflowing was his sort of famous essay, wasn't it? Or one of his famous essays.
Yeah.
And then developing that into sort of the performativity of accounting. It seems to have become quite a buzz phrase. Is that fair? It seems to have sort of...
Yeah, performativity was really big at the time. Because it helped a lot to explain what was happening in markets, right? Where do prices come from, and where does value come from in a sense, and how value gets destroyed also. And so I think again, Donald and Yuval as well, they kind of set the scene, and but then people in France as well, like Fabien and also Michel Caron and others there. So performativity was one way of kind of talking about the role of numbers, I guess, in all of this, and of models, and in creating reality. So I think much of the early discourse was still kind of very much impressed by social constructionism and everything that went with it. So, and that's where also the connection with science studies was very evident. So many of the early people at that angle, social studies of finance, and also then some who went into accounting, they had this STS background, like Don Mackenzie or Karin Knorr, Alex Preda. The unit in Edinburgh was science and technology studies. Originally science studies. And that's where you all studied, right? And so it's really interesting. And I think there were some of the connection points with accounting discourse worked through that, because in accounting, people had also discovered Latour and STS. So there's this idea of the factory as a laboratory, and these papers, they had been written, earlier. So there were some obvious points where people could connect because they were already speaking the same language in a way.
So it's really interesting how that finds its way into accounting, because the way I think about it is very much like that. It's like it's you're making new knowledges, you're making things valuable, and making value claims. And so for the podcast, the Laboratory Life 1979 and Science in Action, which was another Latour, develop a lot of kind of methodologies of how knowledge gets constructed, and then that's then finds its way into accounting, where we're thinking, well, how is it that truth in organizational settings gets established and market settings as well. And you've used your sociological background, Max Weber, Van Goffman, quite a bit as well. Do you? I guess a really open question. How do you see that in terms of what you can bring as a sociologist, or vice versa? What some of these sort of science studies theorizations bring to sociology?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think my own thinking in that respect has also changed over the years. So in the beginning, I really thought this is about numbers and what numbers do in social life, the work they do, and kind of what you can, literally do with numbers. And that was really also my interest. So I kind of trying to figure out what people do with numbers and how that kind of influences how people work together, how they live together, and all of that. And originally, my interest was also in public management, very much so, and I could see that it was doing a lot of work in public management reform, right, and new public management. So kind of became really important, and my sense was that this is about the numbers, and I could see that some of the legal expertise was being replaced by business expertise, and the business expertise was stronger on numbers, and that was a way in which organizations' management really changed significantly. So that was my first sense, and it also gives you an idea of how I thought at the time accounting would fit into our reading of kind of social behavior, social structure. So kind of, for me, in the beginning was the numbers people, kind of what it's. But that has changed over time. So nowadays I think of accounting more in terms of writing and documenting and keeping a record, and that's a bit broader, I think. And you had Keith Hoskin on the podcast, and I think some of his work's been quite important to me for bringing that out, kind of, and to look at accounting more as writing, not just in terms of numbers, but of kind of keeping an account in physical form, in a way, and doing stuff with that. So numbers are part of the story, but there's a lot more going on around numbers and keeping accounts and reproducing them.
It's not just about the numbers, it's about the statements and the way in which numbers are reproduced.
Yeah, I'm thinking more and more like that, because if you think about accounting very rigorously, you see that I think that it's a writing practice of writing things into the world, and it has a lot to do with how we read the world visually. And so if you think about that, then really you need to think of accounting more at the same level like people like Derrida would think about writing and text and all of that. So it becomes something very general that's very much, constitutive for social order per se, and how we see the world and live in it.
You've got I'll just give a name drop. The paper you wrote was AOS 2007, How to Do More with Numbers, which I found really interesting. You use Van Goffman in that, and you're trying to really get at this question, is there something kind of special about numbers in particular? The commensuration, the ordering, the keying up, which is sort of creating distance. So all of that's still happening, but it's slightly, you see it slightly broader now.
I think that's something really powerful that you can do with numbers. Kind of, you can abstract, and but you can also bring them down and be quite forceful with what you're kind of claiming. If you have kind of the scaffolding, as it were, in place. So the paper is also a lot about the scaffolding. I think about how this actually is quite complicated, right? We use numbers, but a lot of stuff happens at the same time, and that's because we have structures in place to make sense of numbers, but also at the same time knowing that we are also just counting, as it were. So numbers are really interesting because they work at different levels, and the paper is about that. Because if you think about it, even the kind of the simple operations such as counting, it's very complex when you kind of try to unpack it and see what's going on, because you're following this numerical series. At the same time, you're relating it to something in the world. Then it's you doing it, and you're following certain rules. But somebody observing you will observe all of that at the same time, and it's quite an amazing cultural achievement.
That really gets into one of your other interests, which is this idea of change and the role that accounting plays in change in society. You wrote a piece relatively recently, Public Value and the Planet, and elsewhere as well, about this idea of how accounting, or like you just described exactly, gets sort of tangled up in these sort of assemblages, I suppose, of making things happen, making things valuable. But then you sort of take that a step further and you sort of say, well, if that's the case, you need to think about, well, what positive role can accounting play in issues like sustainability and climate change and so on. Um, could you tell us a bit more about some of the ideas in that paper? And particularly, you touch on this idea of full tax accounting. And again, it's a very outward looking paper, thinking about how accounting can influence. What were your ideas in writing that piece?
Yeah, I think that's something we really need to get our heads around, right? Because we are we're in a position where we really need to rethink about who we are and where we are, and so that concerns our idea of the public, right? And public value is kind of on one level a really horrible kind of neoliberal idea, almost kind of that's being used to talk about value for money and taxpayers' money, and so it's almost like a whip for public sector organizations, and but it's also a concept that was kind of put in place to understand a bit better what is valuable to the public and kind of to take it away from this new public management discourse. So, and with the ecological change that we are facing, it's very clear that we need to think about the public, not just in terms of the human taxpayers and their interest, because if we do that, we end up being in a bad place, right? So we need to have a more ecological understanding of our shared spaces and also our shared communities, because we need the other beings, right? Not just, I mean, the ones that look like us and pay taxes, right? Even for human beings, thinking of the taxpayer is kind of a restrictive idea about the public interest already. So if you broaden it beyond the actual human taxpayers, you broaden it beyond the human stakeholders, so you broaden it towards other beings that we should recognize in the public, and then the idea of what is public value should change accordingly. And full tax accounting is a way of thinking about this and reutilizing some of the language that we already have to talk about these things. And in this case, to think about taxpayers a little more broadly, because who's really paying the taxes for what we do? It's not just us as human beings, it's also other beings who actually kind of bear the burden of our collective activities. And that's actually an idea you already have in economics, right? When you think about implicit taxes that the government doesn't really raise, but there's still a burden placed on people through kind of what we do collectively. So inflation, right? So that's a tax exacted on the poor, right? And it's a regressive tax, right? So it's really something that where people suffer as a result of what we do collectively. So you could say that's a tax, and governments should be careful not to impose that tax because it's not just. But once you accept that there can be explicit taxes, well, you can apply it also more widely, and the paper's trying to utilize that to really broaden the remit of thinking. I mean, of public value and also public action, I suppose. I mean, to address, I mean, lack of public value. Yeah, because we need to then create people for the real tax people. We need to create value for the real taxpayers, I would say.
Yeah, which is we need to think about much more broadly. To link into your answer on that, Hendrik, one thing I've been pondering, and I don't know if it's right or not. Do you see that in accounting we've maybe in critical accounting as a field we've become more aware of this question of what you do with the accounts, what you can do with the accounts? So maybe moving past a more neutral empirical look at what is happening out there in the real world, and maybe thinking more about, well, actually, what's the political or the social role that accounting, ought or should play? What's your view on that as a discipline? Are we moving towards that, or?
I think that that's what we ask ourselves probably all the time, right? I mean, particularly now after COVID, I think it's been a period now where we come back, and I think most people I speak with, they give me the sense that we're all thinking about this a lot harder than we used before because we had this interruption, and now we're coming back, and we're probably asking ourselves a little more than before. I mean, what is it all for, right? And yeah, so I think it's this kind of punctuation, kind of this interruption of an activity that we had was really a chance for many of us to reflect on this and to rethink our position in the world out there and become more reflective and reflexive actually about what we do. And that's not just us. I think that's many people working at academia questioning themselves. We have these discourse about quiet quitting and many people leaving academia, and I think this is because a certain dissatisfaction with the way things are. And I think those who remain will not necessarily be those who will be, I mean, happy, but it may also be those who will think, okay, I'll stay, but next time I'll put up a fight if it comes again to this point where I'm not really comfortable with doing something I'd rather not be doing.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense in a way because if one of the theses of critical accounting is that accounting is active, it's not neutral, and it's very powerful, then the question of that of what you can do with accounting and accounting education and things, and it seems an interesting kind of space to explore or move into with all of the big challenges you've been talking about.
Yeah, yeah, and at the same time, we see kind of all the glossy discourse, right, from the profession, for instance, about sustainability. So a couple of years ago, if you had been the one kind of offering that kind of discourse, you would have been kind of the eco warrior or the crackpot in the corner. And now this has become mainstream, and that makes us all a bit uncomfortable, probably at a certain level, because we feel like, okay, now the powerful people are moving into that space where we didn't expect them, and we better be there as well, right? Because we see what will happen if, for instance, accountability for ecological damages and problems gets reframed the way, say, the IFRS would think about it, that it will have consequences. And so, this is because we know what it does, right? And what it means to narrow accountability down to an investor focus, because it has happened before. Right? Accounting wasn't always like that. Right? It has become also market focused, and if that now happens with, say, ecological value, we know it's not a great thing.
Yeah, so it's learning those lessons. That seems like a good point in which to ask you about this fantastic new edited volume you've been working on and working with colleagues from across the field, the Handbook of Accounting and Society. What was your motivation in putting that handbook together, and could you tell us a bit more about some of the interesting contributions people are developing to that handbook?
Yeah, so I've been really overwhelmed with people's willingness to come on board and contribute to this idea. So the idea is really to put together a showpiece where people see that accounting actually matters a lot in society and in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it, like in the public sector, in social sector. And I mean, you will be in there, I mean, with your work, so in public health. So when we think about the environment, when we think about risk retirement, in all these places, accounting is obviously, I mean, once you start looking for it, it becomes quite obvious. It does matter a lot. But for many people, that's just boring bookkeeping. And it gets not the amount of attention I think it deserves, because I mean, once you start looking, it can be, I mean, really eye-opening what accounting does and the power it exercises over life. So there will be, a really broad range of contributions that talk about these happenings of accounting in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. At the end of life, for instance, um, yeah, yeah, lots of contributions, and I struggle a bit to highlight a particular one, but I mean, just watch this space. I think it will be a really nice product at the end of it, and yeah, I can't wait to see all of these papers come in. Yeah, but it won't be my work, right? It will be the work of the contributors. So I'm really just amazed how many people, my colleagues, are willing to contribute, even knowing that it's not going to be a 4-star publication or not even a 3-star, but just an edited volume. But there's probably also something about opening the floor, right, and giving people the chance to say what they really would like to say.
Yeah, I mean it's a really exciting project, and you've done a fantastic job in bringing all these people together. It's gonna be great. I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah, I mean I did get some advice at some point. I won't say where or when. Don't write a book chapter. It's not going to be referable.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought, no, I quite fancy writing a book chapter. It sounds quite fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's. But thanks for doing that. And it brings us kind of full circle in a way, because you said how the piece you wrote in 2003 in CPA, in that paper you reflect on the Handbook of Economic Sociology, and you say how there was, despite accounting being so central, Max Weber, you quote Abbott. There's almost no accounting in that handbook.
Yeah, I mean it's a good point. That concern is obviously still alive and still. I mean, I've become a traveler, right, kind of between disciplines, and I don't bear a grudge also, but I feel like people should be paying more attention in sociology to accounting and realize the work that's being done that I think is sociology in a way. Right? So within sociology, you often get this question: is this sociology or not? But I don't think if people would just spend a minute and take a look at what research is being done in accounting, they would not. They would have no doubt that this is social science or sociology. Um, so it's really just a matter of just showing people what's going on. And I must also say the sense of community within accounting, I mean, within the critical accounting space, is amazing, right? Because you don't get asked that question. I mean, is that accounting or is that accounting research? That doesn't happen so much in that community. Whereas in sociology, you have to pass as a sociologist, and that gets very constraining. So, I mean, and that's probably where my kind of where my thinking is in terms of pay attention to accounting research and engage with it, and yeah, and come over if you can. I would say, because you will find a nice community where people actually want to talk with you.
You almost headed off my next question, because I was going to say sometimes as a PhD student you might get asked, well, is this accounting? And you said that doesn't get asked quite so much in the community because it's kind of supportive and we've got a broader idea. But what would you say if a PhD student is asked that question? Is this accounting? Maybe with an air of sort of skepticism about their projects. What would you say to support that student? I guess.
That's a good question, but not the one, is this accounting? That's a bad question. Right? The good question is how to respond to that, because it's a very aggressive question. It's kind of the type of justify your existence to me question. So I guess that's the kind of question an economist would ask, but a sociologist sometimes as well. Right? So I guess disciplines ask this kind of question because they have people who believe too much in the integrity of the discipline. They ask this question because they want you to pass. So I think an answer needs to be strategic, and you might even want to lie to people, right? Because this is it's an aggressive situation. You're being attacked, and or you might want to crack a joke. But it's not something that I would take seriously as an intellectual question, because we all know that that will depend on how you see accounting and how broadly you see accounting. So if somebody asks that question, the communication is, you're out of my space, right? And you've kind of ruled yourself irrelevant for my understanding of accounting, and now convince me that I should let you back in. So that's horrible to start with, and so I think any answer is good, and yeah, tactical warfare is absolutely allowed at that point.
So yeah, so the
So don't
question,
let it get to you. I
yeah,
think that's
don't
what
let
I'm
it get
saying.
to you. That's good advice, I think, and yeah, so it kind of implies a sort of certain assumptions about what accounting should be, and actually it's more than that. So thank you, Hendrik, for the responses. That's been really interesting so far. I wanted to also ask what your advice would be for either PhD students or early career scholars considering a career in critical accounting. Given that there's a lot of perhaps precarity and security at that stage of the career, people might consider, well, do I stay in academia or do I go into industry or elsewhere? What would your advice in general be for someone looking to come into critical accounting at that stage of their career?
Well, I would say welcome, and don't be afraid. And there are jobs. There are more jobs than in other areas. I mean, part of the reason why I ended up in the UK is because of that, because it's easier to find a job in accounting than in sociology, for instance. And I think that's still the case. So we need people, and you will find a job. So I mean, if you want to be a social scientist, this is one of the better areas to be in, with a good job market and an interesting job market where you have an impact. But now I'm talking about the motivation, right? I think for doing research and kind of positioning yourself, I would say don't be too opportunistic about this. Go really towards the research you would want to do, because you'll spend a lot of time on it, and you need to kind of be your own best supporter most of the time, right? Because yeah, the amount of support can be variable, right? So you need to kind of cheer yourself on, and that will work better if you have a topic that you really strongly believe in and really want to do, and reach out to people. That's probably the most important thing when it gets towards, I mean, finalizing the PhD. Reach out to people, and it's a really nice community to be in. People know one another. I haven't seen that in sociology as much as I see it now in accounting, which I mean nominally should be a bigger community because it's international, right? But people in accounting realize when PhD students come on the job market, right, you'll be noticed. Whereas if you're in sociology or other social sciences, you won't be noticed so easily. And particularly in that critical accounting or social accounting, it's a tight knit area, and it's actually a lot of competition to get people into positions and to recruit them. And it's not easy for us finding people to actually bring on and work with.
And that brings me to the other point I wanted to ask you about. So you've talked about how you've sort of translated into accounting, in critical accounting from a sociology background. You also came to the UK from Germany, and you used to write quite extensively in German, and now you write in English. Um, what would you say about that sort of transfer as well from Germany to the UK in terms of academia?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that in a way happened to me, but I'm really grateful because I only have one person to thank, which is again it's Yuval, who joined Leicester and then at some point reached out and kind of whether I would be interested in joining, and I thought about it at the time, and I had this interest in accounting for a while, but in Germany I had nowhere to take it, and I would always be in the position to explain myself and my interest in accounting. I've done other works also in German. I've done this work on disaster, but at that point in time, I felt like, okay, if I go to the UK and join an accounting group, I could really do this and try it out full time and see where it takes me. And it was quite a big step, but I never regretted it. I never looked back. Um, and I'm quite pleased with where I am now. And well, still, the other year I had to finish a piece in German about Natur and Sloterdijk, and I found it quite difficult to write in German. So I think that has changed now as a result, but it is what it is. And you find many more readers in English. Right? Yeah, and it's all down to the community, I must say.
Fantastic. So we've got the Handbook of Accounting and Society. When can we look forward to that perhaps being published?
So we are looking now to complete it by next August, and then it hopefully will be out in the April of 2024. I mean, fingers crossed. I mean, a lot can go wrong here, but that's the ambition. I mean, it's a bit ambitious, right? But I mean, so far so good, and people have been really supportive. So let's see. I'm really looking forward to finishing that at some point, but we're still in the early stages in a way. So it's all curating and collecting and seeing it pile up. We have the abstracts now, and hopefully over the next few days, I'll spend some time kind of kick-starting the I don't know how should it the hype mill for that on social media.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Well, I look forward as one of the authors to getting a kick in from you on that, Hendrik. Thank you so much for
Be careful what you wish for.
thank you so much for your contributions, and thank you for speaking to us on the Critical Accounting Podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for your time.